The honourable lady seeking to withdraw the amendment. Your Lordship's place the amendment be withdrawn. Amendment is finally withdrawn. Amendment number 14, Baroness Monckton.
My Lords, I rise to speak to Amendments 14 and 27 in my name. And I'd like to thank my noble friend, Baroness Neville-Rofe and Baroness Barron for their support. Amendments 14 and 27 would prevent commencement of this Act until an impact on an assessment of the policy on persons who provide transport for children with special educational needs is published. Those who provide transport for people with special educational needs provide a service that is very often not understood by those who aren't in that position, who don't have children, who have a real problem in getting to school. These companies providing daily transport to children are now facing a rise to their employment costs. It is typical for drivers and their assistants to work for 3.5 hours a day. That brings them into this new threshold, and the increased rate of employer insurance will apply. The sum of 515 million previously mentioned as being put aside for the councils is to offset the national insurance contributions for their own employees. This sum would not offset the indirect costs from council services delivered by private providers. Councils have a statutory duty to provide these services. If private transport is no longer financially viable because of the new rules, the councils will then have to re-tender thousands of contracts. Knowing at first hand, through my own experience of running a charity, how long it takes even to get a normal DBS check, we're going to be in a situation where some children will not be able to get to school until all of these checks and balances and forms have been filled in. This transport is an absolute lifeline, and I know that is a hackneyed phrase. It is a lifeline to parents. It enables parents to continue working, as they don't have to drive the frequently very long distances that some of these children have to be taken to the nearest school that can accommodate their needs. Some parents who live near us in East Sussex, told me of the enormous difference it made to them as a family. Before they had access to this transport, both parents worked. One of them had to stop working in order to drive the child backwards and forwards to school. Then they got access to transport. And what the father said to me was that for the first time, he did not have to worry about his child. He could go back to work. He could actually become the person who he was before he had a disabled child. And that portion of his day spent in the office was absolutely invaluable to him. My own daughter had somebody who drove her to school every day, Terry Heseltine. And I spoke to him today because what I hadn't realised is that 90% of his work is spent driving children with acute and complex needs to schools with an assistant. And he said to me, for many, this is the only way that they can get to school. Most of these parents don't have cars. These children, who are often violent and unruly behaviour, would have no other way of getting to school. We cannot let down this group of vulnerable people and their exhausted parents. So these amendments are important because the increased cost of this policy on those who provide transport for children with special educational needs could result in job losses, reduced services, and an absolute unimaginable nightmare for these children and their families. My Lords, I beg to move.
My Lords.
Then insert the words on the martial list.
My Lords, I stand to support my noble friend's amendments, but we'll speak very briefly. The Minister in the other place had said that there had been an assessment made by the Department of Education on the impact of national insurance contributions, the rise in it on special educational needs. Bearing in mind the debate we've already had on the lack of impact assessments, if an assessment's been made, it should be shared. We've already seen the disproportionate impact of the VAT on independent schools and the impact it's having on children with special educational needs. And this, again, tantamounts to a double whammy. These are amongst the most vulnerable in society. If I reflect my time many years ago as a councillor in my local authority, the vital link these drivers provided, the lifeline they provided, as my noble friend has articulated so passionately and with poignancy, is essential. And I also reflect on the statement made by the Chief Secretary in the other place, which said that these changes, when we're pursuing economic growth, they must permeate every element of society. I paraphrase, every part of our country. How can impacting the most vulnerable contribute to any kind of sensible understanding of growth? So I say to the noble Lord, the Minister, I was a minister for a long time, and perhaps that's why I'm not counted in with the dynamic duo on my side of the House, of the noble lady Neville Rolfe and noble lady Baroness Noakes. But one thing ministers do in your Lordship's House is listen, which the noble Lord is doing. But that listen also turns into action. There are many vulnerable groups, including those highlighted by my noble friend, who are being impacted. As a minimum, surely engagement at this stage, after all, that's what we're all about. Scrutiny, listening, reviewing, and ensuring that the legislation, when it leaves this House, is in a better state than when it got here. So I would appeal to the noble Lord, as a minimum, engage, listen to some of these groups that my noble friend has highlighted, and perhaps through his intervention, the government will think again.
My Lords, the committee is very much in the debt of my noble friend for having raised this important issue this afternoon, because I think it presents a microcosm of all the arguments around the bill. It is a narrowly focused amendment, and it draws the committee and the House's attention to one narrow measure, one small part, but very, very important part of our national life. And therefore, it really is incumbent on the Minister to give a substantive answer. And I think not just we don't do further impact assessments, because I'm not sure that there is a widespread belief in the country around the impact assessment, that the Treasury note that's been made. I don't believe that that gives sufficient confidence. It's a short, very high level note, and at the bottom of it said, of the electronic page, said, did you find this page helpful, yes or no? And I think most members of the committee would reply in the negative. Well, my Lords, I think it is important for the Minister to really listen to an illustration of the effect that this bill will have. Yes, as we've heard in previous amendments, on the wider growth of our economy and the impact that it will have there, but also on the impact on extremely vulnerable people, as is illustrated by my noble friend's amendments. And I very much look forward to the Minister's detailed and substantive answer.
My Lords, I rise to speak to Amendment 67, which stands in my name, with the support for this amendment from the noble Lord Alton and the noble Lord Forsyth of Drumlene, whose names were not entered in time for the marshalled list. My Lords, I am in agreement with much of what the noble Baroness Lady Monckton of Dallington Forest has to say in support of Amendments 14 and 27 in her name, and others concerning the provision of transport for children with special educational needs and disabilities. Many years ago, my identical twin brother was one of these. My amendment has the same intention, albeit a slightly different effect. My Lords, when I raised my concern at second reading, the Noble Lord, the Minister, in response, referred to both the increased settlement overall for local government in the coming financial year and to the extra 550 million to cushion local authorities against the impact of national insurance changes. I wrote to the Minister on the 10th of January about my concern that such funding did not cover contracted out services, and I have yet to receive a reply. Hence the amendment in my name today, which is now before your Lordship's House. My Lords, the Local Government Association on the 28th of November stated that the measures the government seeks will, I quote, lead to a 637 million increase in council's wage bills for directly employed staff and up to 1.13 billion through indirect costs via external providers, including up to 628 million for commissioned adult social care services. It is clear then, my Lords, that the concerns I laid before your Lordship's House on the 6th of January are well-founded and remain current. My Lords, the transport provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities is of necessity a very labour-intensive one. It also requires dedicated recruitment, since not any driver will do, and in some cases a passenger assistant is also required. The children involved, as we have heard, place enormous value on continuity and trust. Hence it is key that they trust the staff who serve them in this way, and once that trust is established, these are the people with whom they routinely deal. It is hard to describe the anguish that will result if contracts become unviable, my Lords, nor the additional pressures this will place on parents. There will be inevitable breaks in education which can easily affect the rest of an individual's life. My Lords, those of you resident in North Yorkshire or the West Riding or North Lincolnshire and South Yorkshire may have seen the regional news bulletin, ITV Calendar North, on the 22nd of January, just a few days ago, whose first and main news item was this very issue setting out with some of the people affected what the impact would be. It is hard not to sympathise with the bewilderment of the mother of a mute child, for example, at the very real likelihood of the loss of her son's provision. My Lords, I accept governments take tough decisions and that there is a burden to public service borne by those who serve us in this way. However, in this instance, the chief burden, the chief distress, the overwhelming hardship will be borne by SEND children and their parents. As this is a situation brought into being by the government, then it is appropriate to look to His Majesty's government for a solution, and I would happily withdraw the amendment if they were to proffer a remedy, such as ring-fence funding. Unlike Amendments 14 and 27, my amendment, which requires the government to review and estimate the impact on the SEND transport sector in each of 3 tax years, and to state what remedy might be applied, includes the ameliorating provisions of Clause 3. However, as your Lordships will have established, and the Noble Lord, the Minister, knows, Clause 3 will not be the remedy here. I therefore beg to move the amendment standing in my name.
I rise very briefly to offer the Green Group's support for all of these amendments. I think perhaps the Right Reverend Prelate's amendment gives the government a way forward that doesn't interfere with the general progress of the bill, but any of these would do. I'm just going to make 2 quick points. One, I note the briefing I received from the chair of the licensed private hire car association SEND group, setting out the points that have been made of how desperately they are concerned and what chaos this national insurance rise has a potential to cause for them. I also want to point out that there is, of course, in the other place, the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. The government is trying to deal with and help and support particularly children with special educational needs and disabilities and their parents through that bill. And then what we have is this bill which is undoing, creating further risks and further damage. So I think it's useful to set those two against each other. And in your Lordship's House, we so often hear expert testimony about how difficult life is for children with special educational needs and disabilities, and of course their families and parents. This is just such, I'm going to use an informal term, such a no-brainer to sort out.
Lords, I rise just very briefly. If I'd spotted the Bishop of Southwark's amendment in time, I would have signed it, because to me it makes absolute sense. There is a pressure that is created when one knows that a review is coming afterwards to actually think through actions now. My Lords, I think we all in this committee recognise that this is a bill that deals with the weakest of the weak. And if there are two bills, this one and then one in the other place, either of which could be used to manage a remedy, I would have thought the government might be able to see a way through this. I just wanted to say one procedural thing, just as a comment on the statement made by the Bishop of Southwark. I hope he realises that if he doesn't withdraw his amendment at this stage, he won't be able to bring it back at report. So I think some people are not clear on that particular element of the procedure, so I just simply mention it in case it guides what he might wish to do.
I just say to the Noble Baroness, his amendment is 67, so he's not going to be moving it until day 4. He can't move it. He can't move it.
Problem solved. I'm in my place. But those are the only comments that I wanted.
My Lords, I also rise in support of Amendments 14 and 27, tabled so movingly by my noble friend Baroness Monckton of Dalington Forest, and Amendment 67, moved by the Right Reverend Bishop of Southwark, with additional and disturbing evidence on this vital issue. I'm sorry that my noble friend Lady Baron, who leads for the opposition on education, isn't able to be here. She's detained elsewhere. But I know she's very concerned, as you would expect, about the thousands of SEND children who might be left without transport, because the amendments concern the transport providers for children with special educational needs and disabilities, and of course they play a pivotal role in ensuring that children with special educational needs and disabilities can access education and other vital services. So a way must be found in this bill or elsewhere to deal with the devastating impact on those transporting such children, most of whom, as we've heard, only work 3.5 hours a day, according to the SENDTO group of the Licensed Private Hire Car Association. So they'll be caught by the lower NICS threshold, which we've been discussing on other amendments. My Lords, the potential impact is not a hypothetical concern, and I think it's another good example of the perverse effects that we're seeing. So MENCAP, a charity that supports such individuals and families with these disabilities, has shown that the rise in national insurance contributions could force it to close at least 60 of its essential services. And those include running residential services for people with learning disabilities, offering advice on issues such as education and employment, as well as offering support for carers, a very, very important matter. This charity is facing an additional £5.3 million in annual cost due to the effects of the budget. Therefore, I ask the Noble Lord the Minister to look into the various points that have been made today, to undertake a proper assessment of the impact and of the cost to the sector, and come forward with amendments or other concessions to ensure that the transport providers are not put in a position where they can no longer meet the needs of these vulnerable children. That would be wrong.
My Lords, I am grateful to all noble lords who have contributed today. I have, of course, listened very carefully to all the points made during this debate. I will address the amendments tabled by the noble baronesses, Lady Monckton of Darlington Forest, Lady Neville Rolfe and Lady Baron, and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Southwark, about the impact of this bill on persons who provide transport for children with special educational needs and disabilities. Please let me say at the outset I will endeavour to get the Right Reverend Prelate an answer to his letter as quickly as possible, and I apologise to him for not having replied sooner. The Government, of course, carefully considers the impact of its policies, including these changes to employer national insurance. As I have noted previously, an assessment of the policy has already been published by HMRC in their tax information and impact note. With regard to the specific issue of the provision of transport for children with special educational needs and with disabilities, the Government is committed to improving provision in mainstream state schools, while also ensuring that state special schools can cater to those with the most complex needs. At the budget, the Government announced a £1 billion uplift in high needs funding and £740 million into creating more inclusive specialist places in mainstream schools and undertaking the adaptations that may be required in mainstream schools to make them more accessible. The aim is to reduce the cost of transport because far too many children are being transported to other local authorities over a large distance and time as they cannot be educated locally. There are several ways in which a local authority can fulfil its requirements to provide free school transport to eligible children, including those with special educational needs, disabilities or a mobility problem. At the budget and as part of the recent provisional local government finance settlement, the Government announced over £2 billion of new grant funding for local government in 2025-26. This includes £515 million to support councils with the increase in employer national insurance contributions. This £515 million of additional funding has been determined based on a national assessment of the cost for directly employed staff across the public sector. However, this funding is unring-fenced and it is for local authorities to determine how to use this funding across relevant services and responsibilities. This is part of an overall increase in additional grant funding for local authorities in 2025-26 of over £2 billion, resulting in an estimated 3.5% real terms increase in core spending power. Given the points I have set out, I would respectfully ask noble lords to withdraw their amendments.
My Lords, I'm grateful to all the thoughtful contributions to this debate, and I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his comments. But I urge the Noble Lord the Minister to consider the amendments we have been debating and to understand the essential services provided by the SEND transport sector. And I think it's wonderful that you're putting more money into the schools, but if these children can't get there, it's not going to really work. However, for the moment, I beg leave to withdraw.
Conscience wishes the amendment will be withdrawn. Amendment by leave withdrawn. Amendment number 15 already debated. Baroness Lawler, not moved. The question is that clause 1 stands part of the bill. As many that can will say content. Contrary not content. The contents have it. Amendment 16 already debated. Baroness Kramer, not moved. Amendment 17 already debated. Baroness Kramer, not moved.
It is now adjourned.
The committee stands adjourned.